This is an extremely brief tutorial on MLA citation within your essay. I did a previous video on how to format your essay according to the MLA parameters, and now here's how to correctly cite sources in your MLA formatted essay. And so the first thing to know is that there are two parts of correct MLA citation. The first is citing in text, and the second is citing on the Works Cited page. Ever so briefly, in text, what you need, the information you need is last name of the author and the page number if your source is in print and has been typeset. Very often with web sources or online sources, you have only last name, not the page number, and so in that case, you would just completely exclude that or skip over it. I want to start with the more complicated one, the Works Cited page, where you include all fundamental publication information. So let's start there. First, on your Works Cited page, you'll need to gather the following information of your source, each source you use in your essay. And this is MLA Citation according to the most recent version, which is the 8th edition. The information you need for your Works Cited page entry is author, first and foremost, title of the source, title of the container. We'll talk about what the container means in a moment. Other contributors to the source, whatever version and number is associated with the source you have, who published it or who's the publisher, when that publication date happened, and what the location is where you found that source. So most sources have an author who claims it, and that's going to be your primary piece of information that you'll use later in your in-text citation. If you don't have an author name, then you would revert to the very next piece of information you have, which is the title of the source, very often title of the article that you're reading and using in your essay. And if that doesn't happen, if you have neither one of those, which happens sometimes if you're citing a source that is, say, an institutional website in which you're citing what, say, some company or institution states as their, say, mission or their official stance on some type of idea, then maybe you don't have a title, maybe you don't have an author or title of source, but instead you have the title of that institution's website. So that would be the next piece of information you go to. So what does that whole container thing mean? That means the larger work that contains the source. So if you found an article in a book, then your source is that article and it's contained in that book. So the book is the container. If you found an article on a website, then that article is contained in the website. Therefore, that website is the container. It happens to be just a new piece of terminology that the 8th edition of MLA uses, and it's not as complicated as professors make it out to be. Students seem to get it right away. Other professors seem to balk at it. I think that's just some stuffiness and stubbornness on their part. If your source has a second container, for instance, you found a source, you found your source, and that's contained in one thing, but you accessed it within another thing, then you have that secondary list of information that you would contain as well in the same Works Cited entry. And again, it would be that these fundamental pieces of information, what the title of that container is, other contributors, version number, publisher, publication date, and location. So for the location, if you're dealing with an online source, that's the web address. MLA in the 8th edition doesn't demand that you include the entire URL, and that has been back and forth in previous editions. The 8th edition says use what you need and use your judgment on that, and so some professors consider the website address optional. I particularly prefer not to have the entire URL copied there. Other professors demand it. Just find out what your professor wants as house rules for his or her class. Okay, so you find the information that you use for your Works Cited entry from examining the work itself, not some other source. And that sounds a little bit like perhaps common sense, but it's not as common as it needs to be. If you want to find out who wrote the article you're reading, look at the article you're reading. If you want to know what the title of the title of the article is, look at the title of the article. Find it there. If you find it elsewhere, it might not match up like you need it to. Okay, so if you don't have a piece of information, you leave it out. Don't make something up and put it in there. Don't make up your own title for a source if the source has no title, and don't try to just find it elsewhere. Leave it out if you don't have any of these pieces of information. Very often for a lot of web sources and web articles, you're not going to have a version. You're not going to have a number. Just leave it out. Okay, so when do you use quotation marks around the title of a source, and when do you italicize? Well, you italicize the titles of self-contained works or containers, such as books or albums or television series. Use quotation marks around sources within larger works or within containers. So an article would get quotation marks around its title, and the publication it's in would be italicized. An article in a book would get the quotation marks, the book would get italicized. A song title would get quotation marks, the album title would get italicized. And so that's how italicizing and quoting using quotation marks works for titles. Don't worry about underlining. Don't underline. If you have the option to italicize, they mean typographically the same thing. Underlining is kind of old typewriter, outdated version of italicizing. Okay, so once you have your fundamental pieces of information that you need, as we just discussed, then you arrange it as a works cited entry in that same order that we discussed. The small little variations you need to know as far as the author, the last name goes first, comma, first name goes second. Then you would have a period after that. And then you have the title of the source, very often in quotation marks, a period at the end of that. And then everything else gets commas in between. Every other piece of information gets commas in between until the very last piece of information in which you have terminal punctuation of a period. And so in that case, title of the container, very often italicized, all that other information, comma, 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 and then finally a period. The works cited entry is a hanging indentation, or it's indented starting with the second line. Everything in MLA is double spaced, by the way. These notes are not, but your essay will be. For instance, a brief glimpse at it like this, in which everything is double spaced, including your works cited entries. And every second line or third, every time a works cited entry continues off to the next line, that next line is indented, or called a hanging indent. And you can format that by highlighting the section you need, and under the paragraph options, under indentation, you would choose hanging there. So, more particular example, if I'm citing an article by Stanley Fish called "Will the Humanities Save Us?", then the information I have according to that site, and here would be the New York Times blog's opinion site, I would have author name, the title of the article, the name of the publication. The New York Times is the same as the container is the same as the publisher in that case, so I don't really need to double up there. I don't at all need to double up because you have no extra information in MLA citations that you don't need. There's the date of publication, and then that's the location where I found it. So my Works Cited entry will look like this. Fish, Stanley, period, will the humanities save us? Terminal punctuations taken care of in the title, all in quotation marks since it's an article, italicized publisher, which is also my container, and then the date. And if I want to go ahead and add the URL, optional on my part, then my Works Cited entry would look like that instead. A different example, one that MLA uses in their handbook. This is not mine, by the way. I don't watch Pretty Little Liars. I'm sure it's a wonderful show, but I'll never find out. So in this example, you're citing a TV show. And in that case, you have, if I just want to cite the show itself, not any particular actor or actress, not any particular writer or director, then what I do is skip any sort of author and I go straight to the title of the TV show and the container of that episode, which is the name of the TV show itself, and so on and so forth, such as the volume number, publisher, date, and a container. Here's an example in which I would have a second container if I found it, for instance, on Hulu. That's, say, where you could find episodes of shows that originally aired on a regular television channel and then later became available online. So I would have two containers in this case, or a second container. And so I would cite Hulu as the place where I found this TV episode. So once I gathered all that information, I would arrange it as we discussed above, according to this hierarchy of what pieces of information I need first, second, third, and so forth. And so that Works Cited entry would look like this. Title of the article, title of the container, all that number, season episode information, the publisher, and the date. And then period, because that's the end of that entry, and I also have that second container associated with it, and I continue my Works Cited entry as normal until that piece of information is done. Hulu along with my optional URL there. So keep in mind that especially in the 8th edition, you cite according to your focus and your purpose and intention. As in other words, there's more than one right way to create a Works Cited page entry. And just like a lot of other important ideas, just because there's more than one right way does not mean there are infinite correct interpretations. There are many, many wrong ways to do it, but there's not one single right way. So keep that in mind in everything in life, of course. So in this case, since there's more than one right way, here's a situation in which you would cite the exact same source, but in two different ways. If you wanted to write about, for instance, the performance of the main character in an episode of Breaking Bad, this should be italicized since that's the name of the show, by the way, then your citation would look as follows. Here is the main person that you're focusing on. In this case, because it's an exception, it's not the author, it's the actor you're focused on. You would indicate that ever so briefly, but directly by adding a comma and actor, and you can do that same kind of thing for other roles that the person you're focused on in your citation takes. In this case, Bryan Cranston is the actor, so Cranston, Bryan, actor, period. Let's say the episode Full Measure, and then you treat this like we did all other pieces of all other sources above and elsewhere. But let's say in your essay, you're not focused on the actor, you're focused on the writing or the production of it, as in who wrote it, directed it, and created the thing. Well, that exact same episode you would cite like this. Vince Gilligan did it, so it'd be Gilligan, Vince, and then his roles, and then you would have all your standard information. In this case, again, we have a second container if you watched it on Netflix rather than its original container or original publisher, AMC, then you would treat it as a second container there, and there you go. So What about the Works Cited page? The title of the Works Cited page is Works Cited, and so don't get creative with that. Don't use quotation marks around it. Just call it Works Cited, just like this. If you just have one work cited, then it would be Works Cited. Very often you have more than one, so Works Cited. Every line is double spaced as usual. The only thing different again is the left align for the first piece for the first line of each entry and the hanging indent for the second, as noted above, and everything will be arranged alphabetically according to the first piece of information that you cite. So in this case, alphabetical arrangement. Don't do, by the way, in MLA, no footnotes as your citation, no numbering for your Works Cited page. Everything uses letters and words, not numerals or numbers. All right, so that covers for us the complexities, ever so briefly, of the Works Cited page, all fundamental publication info. What about when you include that citation in your essay? That's the other part that's absolutely required of MLA citation, the in-text citation, where you cite it in your paragraph and in your paragraphs and sentences. Well, let's talk about that. You need the last name of the author, the first piece of information you name in your Works Cited entry. Very often it's the last name of the author. In the case where we don't have an author, like that Pretty Little Liars episode, Under the Gun, in that case, that would be the first element you have, so that's what you would cite in text. You need a page number if you're dealing with a print source or something that has been typeset. Very often, if you're working off of online sources, you do not have that, so don't treat a web page as a page number. Leave that off and rely only on the first element of the Works Cited entry, such as the last name. If that's all you have, don't make up page numbers for it or don't number it yourself. You're only dealing with what has been officially typeset by a publisher of a print source. So that's becoming rare, but still exists. And then you will need to make sure that you have correct period placement or correct terminal punctuation placement. It will be inside the quotation marks unless you use a parenthetical citation for page number or even last name. Then it would be outside the parentheses. Either way, the in-text citation needs to be contained within the sentence that it's referring to. Let's look at examples. Examples of this. Here we have a sentence that involves a quotation from a book that has page numbers. And here the name of the writer is Jacques Barzun, and so we use the last name, Barzun. On page 11, he said this, or he wrote that, and so here's the quotation in quotation marks. I've already identified the last name of the author in the sentence, and so by the end of the sentence I need to include the page number. Since I already had the author name, I don't need to add it again. And so this sentence reads, according to Barzun, the skill of writing begins when you see a choice wherever there is one. Quotations around the part that's quoted, and quotation marks around the part that's quoted, and terminal punctuation after the page number. You can if you never get around to mentioning the last name of the author, but you have that same requirement, of course, you can include it all in the parenthetical citation at the end. A skilled writer must first see a choice wherever there is one, in quotation, Barzun 11. No P for page number, don't say page, don't include any commas in between the last name and page number, nothing, just last name and page number. If you don't have a page number, then once again, you just go to that first element, usually the last name. In this case, Paul Kingsnorth wrote this in one of his articles, and I found it online. It exists primarily online, so there's no page number. So in that case, last name, quotation, that's all I would need in text. I would need my Works Cited entry as well, but in text, this is all I need. Or if you never get around to mentioning the author, you can include it in the parenthetical citation at the end. Now, how do you manipulate these quotations in text? Well, there are fundamentally 5 different variations. tagging, blending, modifying, omitting, and block quoting. So here are the rules for tagging. A tag is what we call the fundamental introduction to a quotation, sometimes called a quotation tag or dialogue tag. Very often it involves, say, some type of name or noun and then a verb. There are other ways to tag or introduce the quotation separately. Very briefly, the rules are a comma after the tag and a capital letter to begin the quotation. So examples: King's North said, comma, quotation marks, capital B, but religions do not own the sacred. Or the author argues, comma, quote, serial killing is glam killing, and that's Trip Klosterman. And so we got to work that last name in there. You can blend a quotation into your own sentence. In that case, no comma, no capital letter. So, example of that, a skilled writer must first see a choice wherever there is one, and there you don't have a separate introduction for the quotation. Instead, it's blended into your own sentence, so no comma, no capital letter. Or Klosterman wonders whether displaying Gacy's paintings perpetuates the Gothic glamour of mass murder. No comma, no capital. You can modify quotations. You put brackets around anything within the quotation marks that you change. Anything within the quotation marks that you change, put brackets around it, but you only change anything that's absolutely necessary for clarification, unless, of course, you're emphasizing words, as in not changing words, not adding words, but instead emphasizing through italics, then you would want to indicate that as well. So, for instance, changing a quotation. Lovecraft actually wrote, "The appeal of the spectrally macabre is generally narrow," but in the context, it was clear he meant in literature, as in not just like in real world macabre or spectrally macabre, but in literature. And so if I wanted to quote that and I was worried that it might be taken incorrectly out of context, then I could include in literature. I'd put it in brackets to show that I'm quoting him, but I had to add the clarification. Or, for instance, if I wanted to add emphasis, I could quote Kingsnorth by saying there are valid criticisms of de-extinction, but Kingsnorth cares about the invalid criticisms. He didn't emphasize that with italics. Let's say that I did. I would need to indicate that to my reader. You can omit information. You can skip over the middle of a quotation mark. So you don't need to indicate that you've skipped over what came before the quotation or after. All of that's assumed that you're always skipping over before or after. But within a quotation, if you skip over middle parts of it, you can do that if you indicate it with ellipses or the ellipsis marks for anything you skip over. And if you're ending, then you would use a period after the ellipses. So, for instance, Orwell says, "The wretched prisoners oppressed me with an intolerable sense of guilt." He said a bunch of other stuff in between this piece of these two sections of the sentence, but I skipped over those particulars just to get this general idea, and I didn't take it out of context. I just skipped over some details that I didn't need in my quotation. So there you go. I just indicate that with the ellipses. Or you could, for instance, end a sentence here but continue the quotation, indicating that these two sentences were not actually back to back as I have them here in the quotation. I showed my reader that I skipped over them. Sometimes when you quote a lot, as in more than 4 lines of quotation, then you would need to indicate that with block quoting. Let me change the view so that makes a little bit more sense. In this case, let's make sure everything is double spaced so you see how it would look a little bit more accurately in MLA format as well. Our culture trains us to disregard insights that can't be proved logically or logically explained. In the Black Chamber clarifies this, and then I set myself up for a block quotation in which I quote 4 lines or more by Paul Kingsnorth, and then I pick back up after the quotation. This could be our culture's greatest, perhaps most dangerous blind spot. In this case, the quotation no longer has quotation marks around it. I indent the entire quotation. That's why it's called a block quotation, because it looks a little bit more like a block. And I wait to include any of my in-text citation information until after the entire quotation is over. This will be the one instance in which I include parenthetical citation information outside of the sentence that it refers to. Only in block quotations do you do that. And so, in that case, here you go. Kingsnorth is the author of that particular piece of information. So that's at the end of that block quotation, and then my writing can pick back up. So this kind of thing in the context of an actual essay, here's an example in which, for instance, I'm writing along in my essay and I want to quote, and then last name, I used tagging here. There's no page number associated with this. I have a last name of the author, no page number, comma, quotation, capital letter, and then terminal punctuation within the quotation mark. If the reader wants to know more about this author or read that source him or herself, then they can go to, or those readers can look at Bauer here, just skip down to my Works Cited page, alphabetically find Bauer, and then they found all the information that they need there. Was some of that outdated, perhaps? No, all that should still be up to date according to MLA 8th edition. And so here's an instance of changing something, a capital letter to lowercase. Here would be an example of periphrasis, or if you're paraphrasing a source, you would still use the same citation rules. If it's not word for word, but you're still explaining someone else's idea, same thing, last name and page number if you have it. Block quotation in a text, that's where it is. So that's an extremely brief tutorial on how to cite according to MLA format. And for more information, absolutely turn to your professors and to the MLA format text or handbook produced by MLA 8th edition. They also have online sources, and there are many other online sources in which you can see examples for yourself. Thank you very much.